Hi, and welcome everyone to Whole Soul School and Foundation's Fireside Chats for March 2022. I'm Marie Mohler, and I'm an author, intuitive life coach, and a co-host of these Fireside Chats. And I am here today with Lacy Frazer, my co-host, who is a clinical psychologist by training and a practicing life coach and consciousness educator today. And so I want to welcome everyone who is joining us today. Our mission here at Whole Soul School and Foundation is to increase self-awareness, personal empowerment, conscious communication, transformation, and freedom in people worldwide through our good vibes broadcasting and consciousness teachings. We believe that these conversations are the education, and we thank you for joining us. If you are inspired by our Good Vibes broadcasts and want to pay it forward, we invite you to make a donation through our website at wholesoulschoolandfoundation.org. You can also support our mission and our Good Vibes broadcast by visiting our shop at bonfire.com that you can find on our website and purchasing some great designs on a variety of apparel. And lastly, I want to thank our amazing donors who support us, our vision, and our mission so that we can continue to grow and create shows, new podcasts, and new inspiration for a world hungry for change. So we send our appreciation to our donors and supporters for your generous gifts and good energy. And so, without further ado, welcome everyone and welcome Lacy to our Fireside Chats for March 2022.
Wonderful to be here, Marie. Can't believe it's March.
I know.
Although I feel like I say that every month. I can't believe
I know. Time is a funny thing right now, right? So we are back again for another Fireside Chats this month. And we're on the cusp of April. It's just right at the precipice, right, of turning into April and spring here in the Northern Hemisphere, which may relate to some of what we're going to talk about today. So we are here to delve a little deeper into the journey of the rising hero and specifically spotlight what Joseph Campbell calls the resurrection.
Yeah, so I wanted to go ahead, Marie, as I like to do in the beginning of each month's podcast, and talk a little bit, just a brief summation of what we've been talking about at Whole Soul School and Foundation. And we are talking about the hero's journey, and we are highlighting the 11th stage of the hero's journey called the resurrection this month, which means that we are 1 month away from 1 year of talking about the hero's journey. And
in a deeper, bigger way.
Yeah, absolutely. So next month will be our 12th and final stage of the hero's journey. It's been an incredible journey just talking about the hero's journey over the last 11 months. Yeah, it's really been wonderful. And what I wanted to do is, I'm not going to go through every stage like I've done in some past podcasts, just because we're now at number 11 and that could take a long time. But I would like to remind our listeners that I just want to review that actually the 12 stages of the hero's journey, originally written about by Joseph Campbell, are divided into sort of parts, I guess we would say. Basically, there are three parts to the hero's journey. And the first 5 stages that we have spoken about are considered part 1 of the hero's journey, which it all encompasses the departure. So the hero, whether we're looking at the hero within us, whether we're looking at the hero in a story, whether we're looking at the world stage as a hero, etc., we are talking about the first part of the journey, which encompasses the first 5 stages. And I'm just going to name them: the ordinary world, the call to adventure, refusal of the call, meeting with the mentor, and then crossing the threshold to the unknown world or the special world. And obviously, these are all the stages that occur prior to the hero, whatever we're calling the hero, crossing the threshold and embarking on the really journey.
Entering it in a more committed way.
Yes. Really crossing the threshold into the unknown world. I mean, the first 5 stages are all about, the ordinary world and all the things that go on inside of the mind and the heart as the hero decides, are they going to answer the call? Or are they going to venture into the unknown?
They step forward, they step back, they play around with it, they try it on, then they get afraid and they say, no, I'm just going to go back.
Yep.
Right? But by the point in time when they cross that threshold, they really do embrace the great departure, that greater departure.
Absolutely. And they've committed to it.
They've committed
right?
to it.
Yeah. And so then we enter sort of the second part of the hero's journey called the initiation. And that includes 4 phases that we've talked about.
Okay.
And that involves really the journey kind of up to a certain point. And it's test allies and enemies, in which the hero really finds support, meets with foes, learns a lot of skills and abilities. The second one is the approach to the innermost cave. Then there's the ordeal, and then there's the reward. So these 4 stages all encompass the second part of the hero's journey called the initiation.
Right.
And that's really like, I don't know, for our listeners, our podcast last month, I sort of gave this analogy of kind of this hike or this journey up a mountaintop, and at the top of the mountain is the reward for the journey up until that point, right? And so it's kind of, we've crossed the threshold, and then it's the journey after we've crossed the threshold up to the top of the mountain that this initiation phase really occurs. And it's through this phase that our hero, which again could be ourselves, it could be an aspect of ourselves, it could be anything in this world, but the hero really faces a lot of trials and tribulations en route to get to kind of the quote unquote top of the mountain. And they've learned a tremendous amount about themselves through this phase of the journey. Really, it's these 4 phases of the journey, right?
Right.
And then we enter, last month, we began the third part of the hero's journey, which is essentially called the return. The entire phase is called the return. And the first stage of that is the road back, which we talked about last month. And that's sort of, you've gotten to the mountain top, you've claimed the reward, and now it's time to think about heading back to the ordinary world.
Right.
And we're kind of psyched about that. We think, okay, I've faced my ordeal, I've dealt with some of my greatest fears, and now I'm going to head back.
Or I'm going to go on a different path. That's the choice point I think we spotlighted too, right? That not everybody goes back to bring what they've learned to the ordinary world. Some people travel on.
Right.
In a different way. So,
yes.
But yes, please continue.
Thank you. And so the second of 3 stages in this third phase is what we're going to talk about today, which is a really kind of deep and broad and big stage called the resurrection. And interestingly, serendipitously, and apropos-ishness, that's not really a word, but here we are on the brink of Easter, right? And spring, and we're talking about the resurrection.
Right.
So
every spring is indeed a resurrection, right? After winter.
Right.
And so we talked about this before, our seasons every year, regardless of what part of the world you live in, we go through the seasons. And so we have the planting of new seeds every spring, and then the growth and the blooming of those manifestations, and then the harvest in the fall, and then everything dying back, resetting itself in the stillness of the winter for the new birth that comes every spring, right? So there's maybe a crucifixion process in the winter, the death process of the seasons of our lives, and then we move into a new resurrection. And this links to bigger stories, right? We can all think about what's the biggest story of resurrection most people on the planet think of with that language is the story of Jesus Christ and his life, and then his death at an early age through his crucifixion and the facing of that death process, and then the resurrection that came 3 days later. right?
Right.
And so these are powerful energies that are celebrated in the Christian faith, right? At the time of Easter, the Good Friday, all those parts of the Easter, the honoring of Easter and the honoring of what was his life teaching us? What was he teaching humanity for those with ears to hear and eyes to see, right? But he is a story that we can look in our own human history.
Well, and perhaps one of the most well-known hero's journey stories.
Right. On a really massive level, because he also, sometimes when we talk about the hero's journey, you can talk about it through the lens of Joseph Campbell, and there's a lot of mythology, and there's a lot of our stories through time, and there's a lot of characters, and it's fascinating. We get a language, but in my experience of Joseph Campbell, I don't necessarily feel that it lifts off the page into the spiritual realms of the hero's journey, but the Jesus story really combines it all, right? It's all of those things, all the things that he faced in his journey, which is why I think we find his life and his teachings and the messages he had, and potentially digging deeper to who he really was. A lot of people spend a lot of their lifetime connecting with that, right? Or seeking that. So I think he is a powerful story to be illustrating some things to all of us, and his messages still live in many of us today. But here we are. I wanted to take what you're saying. I like that cluster of the first 5 phases of the hero's journey is part of the departure, and then the next 4 is part of the initiation, and then the last ones are part of the great return, right? And in a lot of my messages that come through me and the work that I do outside of Whole Soul School and Foundation, a lot of the messages that come through talk about this great return, but from a more spiritual lens, right? And we have to remember that the hero's journey has layers within it, right? You can have a hero's journey and not spiritualize it, right? Go through tests of your own strength and fortitude and transformation, but maybe for some people it's not a spiritual experience. I'm just saying everybody journeys it their own way. But for people who allow it to be multi-layered, you go deeper and deeper and deeper into the psychology of things, and deeper into the emotions, and deeper into all the layers of who you are, which often engages, when you go that deep, it engages the energy of the spirit, the soul inside us. So when we're talking about the return and we're talking about the resurrection, we can't deny that this is a part of the hero's journey that invites us to potentially go a bit deeper with ourselves, go a little deeper in the conversation. And I wanted to...
before you jump in, I just want to say it's interesting too, because in my understanding of the hero's journey in the beginning, when we talked about the ordeal, I always thought the ordeal was like the big boom, like that was the climax of the hero's journey. And I'm really realizing that actually isn't the case.
Well, they all are distinct. Every single phase tests everything that we felt we were before. Right? So there's no phase that isn't stretching us to grow to another version. So it's not like this phase of the resurrection trumps and devalues in any way the ordeal. Like they're all crescendo experiences in our life from anything that we've understood before those moments. So I think the ordeal is like just an epic part of the journey, because you're going into that process, and we're going to talk about that today. What's the difference between the ordeal and the resurrection phase? And I want to bring in then some words from a website that I found. It's called goalcast.com. They're talking about the hero's journey. And this is what they said about the resurrection. When it appears the hero is out of the woods, there comes a final confrontation, an encounter with death itself. Transformed inwardly and with a personal victory complete, the hero faces a battle that transcends their individual quest, with its consequences far-reaching now for entire communities or even humanity itself. This purification solidifies the hero's rebirth as their new identity fully emerges just in time to return to the ordinary world. And then I just want to bring in a couple of other pieces, because here we are talking about, in the ordeal, I'm going to just use my lens. This isn't anybody else's language, but this is just the words I'm going to give to it today anyway, is that to me, the ordeal is the hero himself or herself facing the greatest demons, the deepest shadows, the deepest triggers that have held us back from being the more of who we're truly meant to be. That is really like a heroic quest where we are facing down the dragon we perceive is outside of us, but it's really inside of us. And it's our own journey to slay those dragons that are us. And we, like this says, with a personal victory complete, we come through the ordeal with a sense of, I conquered that.
I transcended
that. But the resurrection process, I think, is a facing of death. It's like a transfigurational process unto itself. It's bigger than that, where the energy of the individual is kind of put to the side, and what this new facing death itself process is, and the resurrection that's coming, is all part of a journey of doing something for a much bigger cause, a much bigger reason than just the victory of the individual. This victory is one of transcending limitation for all of humanity, for the whole community, for the whole tribe, right? And we can bring up some movie examples of different characters and people who've done this. Even let's go back to Jesus Christ, because again, this is very relevant to a lot of people in the world, whether you believe in the religious teachings that he is the Son of God or not. We can still see him as a teacher and a messenger for all of humanity, that this is a man who went through this experience and had great teachings and was crucified for his teachings and his essence. That was very threatening to the powers in play at of the day. And then he comes, he resurrects. He is born again of the Spirit and almost is bigger than life, right? There is some quote, which I'm sure we're going to talk about these movies, Lacy, but I remember in Star Wars, it's just relevant right here, but I think Obi-Wan Kenobi faces off with Darth Vader in that very powerful scene. Do you remember? They're in that like ship hangar. And I think, Obi-Wan Kenobi shows up, and so does Darth Vader, ready to like meet again. And I think Obi-Wan Kenobi is ready. He's at that point in the hero's journey. Strike me down and I will come back basically 10 times as powerful than you are. And he allows himself to die because he knows the resurrection is far greater. They don't say these words in the Star Wars films, but it's in there if you look for the hero's journey in these movies, in these films.
Well, you bring up a really important point, which Joseph Campbell brings up, is the resurrection stage is the hero must sacrifice in order to be reborn or resurrected. That is a critical component of this journey.
Right. And they've transcended when they are sacrificed in this way that we're speaking of today. It's also an awareness that they are transcending the fear of death, and they're showing this to those people paying attention to their journey, their story, because we're all enamored with somebody who has found this inner peace, this inner grace, this inner strength,
yes,
where death isn't terrifying to them anymore,
yes,
right? And think back to the ordeal. When they're in the inmost cave, the approach, they're getting ready for something. They don't know what it's going to be, but it is their personal quest, challenge, the ultimate test. And they're going to fight for their lives. And they know they're fighting for their very lives. And when they come out standing, they have this personal victory. But that's not the same thing as transcending death, one of the ultimate fears of human beings who face mortality. It's not the same as facing this part of the process in the return, whereas you've transcended all the things of this regular, ordinary kind of world that would say, what's the worst thing that can happen to you? You die. A lot of people have that sense, is like, that's the worst thing. But the person who is in the return has transcended all those false belief systems that we die at all. right? They've transcended the fear of death, and they've actually embraced that they live on. And if you really look for this in the characters, you see it in Aslan in Narnia. He gets crucified. You see it in Obi-Wan Kenobi, right? You see it in Harry Potter, right? All these great stories you see, this plays on because we are fascinated with this part of the unknown. And we're all building up the spiritual muscles. I'm going to say spiritual muscles in the hero's journey. If we go that far, which is what we're invited to do, right? The return isn't just for Harry Potter or Jesus. It's for all of us. We all will face this in some way, this lifetime or another. I don't know how many people talk about this, how many people make it all the way through the hero's journey. Maybe some are stopped at the approach to the inmost cave, right? Maybe they never step into the cave. Some people stop and stunt their growth, even though they've committed to the journey, and they get kind of waylaid somewhere and they find distractions where they don't keep going. But those heroes that keep going, they go through the approach, they go through the ordeal, they come out the other side of that, right? What happens after the ordeal? Sorry, I know there's the reward. Is the reward right after the ordeal?
Yes.
Okay, so then they've climbed to the crest of the mountain, right? The greatest climb has basically the greatest view or the greatest rewards, and they bask in the glow of that. But there is a very distinct energy to me and part of the story of between the ordeal that is like a personal triumph.
Yeah, you said that very well. Yeah.
To this resurrection and return process where we're now facing what a human being's greatest fears are, or greatest challenges, which is reconciling inside themselves our mortality and coming out the other side of that ordeal. Like Obi-Wan Kenobi says, strike me down and I will be 10 times stronger. I think people who transcend that fear of death or their mortality and continue living are some of the most powerful beings that have ever walked this planet. And I think that's what we see in Jesus Christ. That's what we see in the Buddhas or the people who've gone deep into their spiritual quest, their journeys. They've been on a hero's journey, but they actually go deeper, which is the heroic soul's journey, which is a further extension than maybe always where Joseph Campbell goes. I haven't studied his work extensively to know, did Joseph Campbell keep going in that story and talk about really the spiritual ramifications of the great tests at this stage? But it's very powerful. And they talk about, and this is what I want to bring up next, Lacy, that from this goalcast.com that was talking about the hero appears out of the woods and then there comes this final confrontation and encounter with death itself. They're saying there's this kind of psychological symbology in the messages here where in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, self-actualization is secondary to self-transcendence. In other words, once inner battles have been faced and the alchemy of psychological transformation is underway, the next stage is to apply the newfound insights and knowledge to a bigger cause, supporting others or standing up on a mission that will benefit the wider world. And I think that standing up in that bigger mission for your life, becoming a conduit basically for something far greater than you could ever imagined, usually, I'm not saying all the time, but generally comes that call to service, that call to share towards the end of the journey, right? To improve the lives of others without any need for personal gain or rewards or recognition or the big honoring ceremonies of the great hero that you are, right? Something happens when you look down the barrel of death and you really transcend that just becomes a neutralized experience because you know life lives on, right? That's what resurrection is that there is no death. Every ending is a beginning. And you're the continuity that threads those worlds together, right? And the great heroes of our day look through death. They walk through those fires and they come out the other side untouched by the heat of those flames. And only people who have done their work, right, this deeper heroic souls kind of work, come out the other side with some of these things. I think of, we're going to talk about some other story characters, but right now I feel the men in your program, Lacy, a number of them went through that kind of great fire process, and they were in the hero's journey at all those phases. But some of them, not all of them, but some of them went through this next process of really allowing death. And you're going to talk about the different aspects of death, because it's not just physical death. There's other layers to this. But they allowed themselves, the old versions of themselves, to die. There was a death process of all they had been or thought they were
100%
before they entered the hero's journey in your groups. And for those men that go the distance, put in the work, go through the spiritual aspects of the journey, they transcend all the things that previously defined them. And they, in a way, can be very Christian language, but we can say born again, or they can be reborn, or they can be going through this new rebirthing process of a new identity of who they now know themselves to be, right? It's so transcendent and so powerful. And when they do that, they came out of prison, and many of those men, right? I'm not saying all, but many came out with this deep desire of one thing: to serve. 100%, because that becomes their new fabric. That becomes their new understanding of themselves. That becomes the meaning for life inside them. And what motivated them long way back before they were ever on the journey in those groups with you, in those classes. They now understand more of what it's really all about. And it's not about all the awards and the honors and the recognition. It's just about knowing in the beginning of every day and the end of every day, you made this world a better place. Very powerful.
And really what kind of sums up to me what you just said, we can call it the death of the old self and the birth of a new self, or we can call it the death of the ego. The ego really has had to die in a lot of those men. The false identity that was the ego, in order for a new identity, a new transformed, transcended self who walked out those doors, into back towards the ordinary world. That's who they were, but their ego had to die in order for that to happen.
Or else they just repeat the cycle.
Right.
Right, which is what we're using the example of these men, but anybody listening to that can insert themselves.
Right.
And say, if I don't do this kind of work, I'll just bring the old me back into my ordinary world, my ordinary life, and I'll replay another cycle of it. Right? At some point, the heroes in this return process is really well aware now in this third phase, right? This third tier of the whole journey.
Right.
There is no going back.
Right.
There's no, if you thought that was the case at crossing the threshold, it is like times 1,000 at this point. There is no going back. There's only going forward to bring.
Well, there's no going back in the way that you were, or the hero will never be the person that left the ordinary world to begin with.
Even if you try.
Right.
You will try exactly. Knowing you can't unknow what you know.
Right.
And after all that they've journeyed and all the tests and allies and enemies and all the the challenges that just face you at every step in so many ways that's growing you the whole time. Some people do try. I think they maybe say that there's 12 steps here, right? 12 phases. They could say, that's it. I've had it. I'm done. Like, enough with these ordeals. I'm finished. And they try and squeeze back into the ordinary life and say, okay, the mentor who's walking with you say, okay, you could try that.
Give that a shot.
Give that a shot.
See how that works for you.
And, for about a day or a week or a couple of weeks, you can say, I'm not talking to them. I don't want to see my mentor. I'm not looking at that. I'm just going to squeeze back into my little life. And you can. And it's not long before you're like, this is too small. Like, I was out fighting dragons. I was transcending. I was changing the world. How can I just slip back into my old life? I don't know, as something, whatever your former life was, being an accountant. I look at Bilbo Baggins, not that accountants are bad, but, he goes on that grand adventure and he has changed. I've not seen the Lord of the Rings series, so I don't know if they cover what he lives in the Shire after he has his journey in the Hobbit stories. But it is interesting that he goes on that whole adventure, and you see all that he experiences there in those stories. And then he comes back into his little hobbit home in the Shire. I don't know what happens to him, his character of having all those expansive experiences, and what he does with that. But that's kind of the equivalent of what we're talking about. But he completes his journey. He could leave several times in the Hobbit story, and he, I'm sure, entertains that idea, but he sticks it out until the end. And when all of the conflict is resolved, he comes home in the return with the gifts and the knowledge. And the question is, what does he do with that? How does he make the world better by who he is? And I don't know if he does or not. That's an open-ended question. Maybe people who are Lord of the Rings fans can, illuminate that for us. My point is, when that fire is inside you and it's lit and you've come through the resurrection process, which is a more of like a spiritual death. It is a kind of crucifixion that touches not just the ego, which is part of it, but it's really the soul surrendering to any of the ego's fears that this is the worst thing that can happen to you. And it knows it somehow will transcend this experience and come out the other side in a way that it's going to have to go through it to know it. And that's what these heroes do know. And they teach us these things so I don't know if you want to get into talking just about the different layers of, another way to talk about this kind of death. We must die while we're alive, kind of in the hero's journey. Wayne Dyer, that's kind of his language.
You know what? Well, as I listen to you talk about it, and you just are so wonderful at getting into the energy and the essence of, frankly, anything you talk about, but definitely in these stages that we're highlighting in our podcasts. I really can't say it enough that the resurrection is very tied to this incredibly transformed self, that we as the hero transcend this sense of mortality. We can call it death, and it may be a physical death, related to a near-death experience or a death of a loved one, but I think also it can be a mental and emotional death of some sort. It could be a spiritual death like you've talked about. It can be a death of an aspect of ourself.
Right.
And I'd love you to talk about that a little more. So the resurrection is sort of this, it's really hard as I listen to you. For me, it's hard to put it into words. I know that in my sort of macro journey this lifetime, I definitely transcended my own mortality through the experience we went through. I definitely had many ordeals with myself around my own fears and hardships and challenges that we have faced along the way in our journey. But I can definitely say that at the sort of pinnacle of what we went through, we sort of faced a true
crucifixion.
Of sorts, where we had a mental and emotional and spiritual death and really rose like the phoenix from the ashes, which is sort of another representation of the resurrection, right? Mm-hmm. Into very, very different, I'll speak for me, just a different human being, that sees the world through a very different lens. And I know, I can feel in my soul that I transcended something through that time. And of course now I've been a coach and a teacher and a therapist, for 15, 16 years since that period of time. Not to say that I haven't had more challenges and ordeals in that time, but I definitely feel like there's a deeper transformation just doesn't cut it.
Not at this level. If you really go deeper than even just some of these limited descriptions of what the resurrection is, it's multi-layered. And my language would be it's multi-dimensional. I mean, there's just so many layers and dimensions to who we are. And I think when you go through this death process, right, when you encounter death itself, whatever layer, whether it's a mental process, whether it's an ego death, whether it's a death of your attachments, the death of the version of you thought you were expected to be, the death of the life you thought that was meant for you, right? But that somehow is being cleared away from you, and it's not meant for you to be living that anymore. There's so many ways that this shows up for us, or the death of a loved one that we hold dear. And, there's so many things that happen in our lives to facilitate us to access these other aspects of ourselves. This is where somebody, again, I haven't read Joseph Campbell's work, so I might be just misunderstanding some of his intentions, and that's not my intention in these conversations. We've been honoring him the whole way through in these podcasts. But in just some of the things that I see, for me, I can't talk at this stage of the journey and not have the spiritual realms come into the conversation, because it can just be the hero's journey where the hero comes back, which we could even say some of your men as an example. If they don't have a spiritual element to it and they want to serve, you can work in soup kitchens. You can serve humanity in a lot of different ways and give back as a good person. The way I really interpret and feel the resurrection process of the people that really transcend lives and do great things bigger than anybody could have imagined, that kind of thing, right? That like sets humanity free in a kind of way. Or Harry Potter faces Voldemort, goes through that process. We might detail that a little bit in a minute. But he actually, if he's not victorious over Lord Voldemort will be victorious and run that wizarding world. So like the life force of the very wizarding world's existence is kind of caught up in whether Harry Potter lives or dies, right? Well, in this bigger context of the resurrection, some people, not all people listening to this podcast, but some people can understand it's a bigger message moment for all of humanity. And I think that's what Jesus Christ achieved in his life and also in his death. He came to liberate us from what for many centuries before that we had felt like that's it, right? That death is death and that's the end. He was showing us kind of eternal life. Think about the game changer that was for humanity that had lost touch with that concept as a lived experience in something some of those people of the day witnessed, and then they've been trying to give us these stories ever since, right? That is a very powerful energy, and you see this in people who've transcended. I think that's why we find inspiration in people with near-death experiences, where their life was almost really cut short in this way that triggers everybody else around them, their fear of death, witnessing this person. And then when they don't die and they come back from the brink of death, for those people that do, and they come back with stories, especially if they've been touched by spirit on the other side, they have a message that transcends time, that transcends fear, that transcends, and just being in their presence, you get to step into what they know for a moment. And humanity needs, in my opinion, a little more of this. Anita Moorjani comes to mind, who wrote Dying to Be Me,
Yep.
right? And so I don't know if people who are listening know that story. I never read that book. Did you read that book? Mm-hmm. Okay, so I imagine it's a very compelling story, and she was very ill for some time, thinking that this is it. She's going to go through like the last stages. And
she had 29 lemon-sized tumors throughout her body. And she went into hospice, and she fell into a coma at 90 pounds and was supposed to die, and then had an entire journey of the soul, and had
a near-death experience. Right. Meet with some guides or get some downloads, and spirit kind of saying it's not your time, or you have messages to bring back.
Right. Through her near-death experience, she learned a number of lessons and deep wisdom that she was then meant to come back and teach humanity.
This is, again, these are good examples of this really, the hero that enters the kind of the spiritual aspects of the journey, where it really lifts off the page. It's not just a third dimensional 3D kind of model for the hero's journey. It's like many, many, many dimensions. She obviously accessed something more in that experience when all other scientific evidence would have said this woman should have passed away.
Right.
But she doesn't. She comes back from that experience, and what does she do for the rest of her time? And she's still living, as far as I know, right? her messages are for humanity. They're positive, affirming messages that are basically, she's a messenger of transcending death.
Right.
She's a messenger of the return.
Right.
And part of her service to humanity is to be an illustration of the return, of the resurrection. She was resurrected from certain death. It's very, very powerful when we see messengers like that.
Yeah, and as I hear us talk, I think, wow, this is really deep and it's really big. And maybe there's people who are listening who think, well, gosh, I haven't, faced death and this is serious. And what are they talking about, And I think it's important here to say that because I know we have many listeners who can relate to this hero's journey concept. And I don't want people to think that the resurrection is just about, it has to involve physical death. I think that it can involve also things like, the death of a dream, right? Martin Luther King spoke about that. It could involve the death of hope, the death of our self-esteem for some reason, right? I mean, these are all sort of battles fought in everyday life. So we can look at it on one level that the resurrection can come, our own personal experience of a resurrection can come after we have faced the death of
the death of fear itself.
Yes.
It can be, that's a huge one, which you'd think again relates to the ordeal. But again, that was a victory over the triggers and limitations of yourself. This is another layer, if it is triumphing over the death of fear, right? You're doing it for yourself, but you're doing it for more than that. And you will be a messenger of triumphing over fear.
Right.
Of being victorious over things like that, of that nature.
Yeah, I think about, in a way, both you and I work with clients in different ways. And I have said more recently lately, actually, as I have more, I have a lot of people that sit with me, whether it was the men in the prison or whether it's the people I work with now. And many people give me the feedback that they feel like they could actually bring anything to me. They could talk about anything with me. And it's because I think they feel in me, in my energetic vibration, if you will, that I have transcended something. And at some level, I would say I've transcended fear. I mean, fear, people can sit and we can talk about some of the scariest things that they are afraid to face. And I can't remember what you said that made me think about that.
The death of fear itself.
The death of fear itself. And I think for me, that was part of my journey was a lot of anxiety and a lot of fear around a lot of things in my life. And to really sit with that and move through that has allowed me now, as the new person that I am, to help other people transcend their fears, I guess, was my point there.
Well, and what you're talking about is part of the return, which is you embody those aspects that you successfully transfigured, transformed, transcended. Right. And then you're the presence of one who transcends those things. And when people come to you and they have not transcended those things, they can sense the person before them that has.
Right.
And then it's a kind of a new level of being a mentor to people. Like there's the mentor that you meet in the beginning, phase 1 of the departure of the journey.
Right.
Maybe it's the same mentor, but we seek out many layers of mentors.
Right.
And there's mentors, I think, sometimes for the latter aspects of the journey. So,
well, and you and I are good examples of that, because you're a different kind of mentor and kind of at a higher plane. You help people really get in touch with their spirituality or their soul.
Right. Exactly. Well, and free themselves at a whole other level.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And so, and isn't that what everybody seeks ultimately, is we are seeking to free ourselves from ourselves, but there's many, many, many paths to get there. And there's many, many tests that will be put before you to help you grow in that journey, so you do arrive at this greater return and you do become a force for good in the world in this bigger way. But sometimes I would just caution people, because we do have quite a broad audience here at Whole Soul School and Foundation. We have people that find it in some ways through you and through some of the aspects that you teach, and we have people that find it through me. And I think it's important for the people who are more literal thinkers allow yourself for the conversation to be a little broader than you might think. If you hear resurrection, some people might say, somebody once said this about my books at one point. I have this book series. Some people may know about that. Some people may not. But at a book sale one time, I had a little table set up, and one woman walks up with her cane. It was kind of crotchety, and she looks at the book. Many people look at the books. They're illustrated. They're beautiful. They're sweet. And it's hard to be offended by, I think one of the story's titles is called Swallow the Sun. Right? I mean, I don't know how you can be offended by that. But anyway, she just said, sounds like church. And you know what? And for her, that was it. She didn't need to see anything further, and she moved on. I would invite listeners, whoever you are and from whatever angle you're coming to these podcasts from, if you're wanting to grow, don't allow just some words to say, sounds like church, and it's not for me, right? You might miss like the hidden nuggets that are in here for you that are inviting you to grow your perception, to expand your vision, to expand your language, and let in just a deeper piece, like a little bit of a broader perspective on some of these things. So yes, it can be the death of an idea. It can be the death of something you hold dear. It could be the death of a relationship that you feel like must stay together, must live on. There's so many ways that we could be talking about this epic level of, what do they say? When it appears the hero is out of the woods, there comes a final confrontation and encounter with death itself. Now, you as the listener can define how might this show up in your life, or if it hasn't, when it appears, you'll say, oh my gosh, those people were talking about this. Right, because we all face a version of this at some level. So don't think just because we've brought up Jesus Christ that you have to be the Jesus Christ of your experience and invalidate all of the things that we're sharing. You can take the pieces that do connect for you, or the things that make you go, I wonder what they really meant by that. And just explore it. Just allow yourself to learn from whatever this is. I hear things all the time from people that I don't understand. When I listen to quantum physicists, I can tell you, I'm like, I don't know what they're talking about. But I'm certainly willing to be in the expansive perception that they have. And just by being around them, though I don't understand all their language, I grow. So that's also part of the hero's journey too, is being willing to grow, even if you don't understand, but the willingness to be in the energy of people who have grown. Oh, it's a huge, huge part of it, And I think it might be good to give our listeners another really, really good example. I mean, of course, Jesus Christ was sure, but I would call our listeners to pay attention to Harry Potter. I mean, he is such a classic hero, an example of a classic hero. And, the truth is we're not sure whether Harry is going to live or die, up until the seventh book, right? Right. We're not sure. But the fact is he does die, kind of, right? Mm-hmm. And he's a perfect example of what Joseph Campbell really, I think, meant by this stage of the resurrection, because, Harry faces death in the ultimate way. He marches into that dark forest. He stands face to face with Voldemort. He fully is ready to die. He's ready to die. Well, and interesting you said in the dark forest, because he does have to go into the dark forest. That's right. It says, when it appears the hero is out of the woods, he's going back into the woods, right, to die, to face the final confrontation. But he didn't go. This is important, because earlier in the movie, on several occasions, but definitely the Wizard Cup one, where he actually he goes to fight Voldemort on a number of occasions. Mm-hmm. On this occasion, he goes to die. He knows he has to be the one. He has made the decision. He's transcended death. He's transcended death. He knows it must be him, and because of the love he has for his friends in the wizarding world, he's ready. He's ready. It's so powerful. Kind of can bring me to tears, right? And he marches into the dark forest, and he stands face to face with Voldemort, and then he gets kind of blasted into oblivion with the Avada Kedavra curse. And he dies, or so we think. Right?
And then he enters this strange kind of special world where he learns, of course, thanks to the memory of Dumbledore, or the ghost of Dumbledore, that he actually survived the killing curse, thanks to the piece of Voldemort's own soul that lives in Harry's head, right? So Harry survives not because he is an exceptional wizard, but more because he is willing to sacrifice himself for his friends. Right. And Voldemort did not take that into consideration. Voldemort did not take into consideration.
That's a higher power. It's a higher power.
Right.
That transcends death. That's also what we're talking about.
Right.
Deeper
exactly. You know, so in Joseph Campbell's language, the hero, they earn their resurrection through sacrifice. Right. And that's something we haven't said as concisely as I just did, right? They earn their resurrection through sacrifice.
Right. Or putting others' needs before their own.
Right.
At that higher level, not in a martyr type way, but truly for the greater good. I am doing this, right? And the other character that I brought up that to share about, as I often mention, Avatar, The Last Airbender, the animated series. And towards the end of that show, the Avatar knows he has to take out, it's kind of like the Voldemort in the Harry Potter. It's either Aang, the Last Airbender, is going to be left standing, or the Fire Lord's going to be left standing. So there's this battle. You know, it's kind of the old story of good versus evil kind of thing.
Right.
And he's an air nomad, which is kind of more the ilk of like the monks, right? Very peace-loving people. That's who his essence is. And as the Avatar, he knows how to fight all kinds of battles, but there's not a lot of death in the Avatar show. There's a lot of battles, but there's not death. But here, there is this, he knows he has to take out the Fire Lord because the Fire Lord's not going to stop. Just like Voldemort's not going to stop.
For the good of the world.
Good of the world. And the Aang in that whole Avatar world, he's expected to take out the Fire Lord, to stop him in his tracks because he's causing so much destruction. But he can't reconcile that inside himself because it goes against his personal beliefs and his own spiritual progression. This would be like, in their language, probably accruing some karma. You know, to take another life is, the Avatar might do that, but he is an air nomad that's a peaceful, spiritually evolved being. And in his journey, what ends up happening is all the avatars of the past counsel him in kind of spiritual way. And they tell him that in most cases, he can be spiritually evolving. He can put his needs first. But in moments like these, when push comes to shove, you have to put the good of the whole above your personal needs for spiritual evolution. That was a big revelation in that story. And it reminds me of what they're saying from this website called goalcast.com. But they talk about, in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, self-actualization is secondary to self-transcendence. And the way I understand that, if I relate it to the Aang character, is that seeking his own spiritual mastery, right, and what killing another person would do to impede his spiritual evolution is secondary to saving that world.
Yes.
So he has to put his needs on hold so that he can save the world as the Avatar. And the Avatar is the one in that realm that's empowered to bring balance to the world. He has to do the thing he personally does not want to do because the greater good requires it. It's a huge moment and it's a huge decision. And that show is fantastic because there's special twists at the end of how he finds a way through that experience. But he has to be willing to go into that. That's the only way other answers come to him. And he finds a way to do all that needs to be done.
And frankly, he's not by not giving away the whole scene or the end, but this is exactly what happens to him.
It's a death. It almost looks like he's dying and losing the battle when in fact he kind of like Obi-Wan Kenobi comes back 1,000 times stronger than the Fire Lord.
Right.
So, it's a message to all kind of the villains of the world is don't mess with the light. Like just don't mess with that because it's way too powerful. And people who are willing to go through these experiences at whatever level you think you are in your journey, going through some kind of a resurrection and a return, it's really like just a grand finale of the whole journey. There's a lot wrapped up in those 3 phases that is just unbelievably expanding of us as people. And I've seen it happen in many people that I've known over time. I watched it in a lot of your men, and it touched my heart. I think that there were a lot of times that it almost brought me to tears. And I'm friends with a lot of them now because they podcast with us at Whole Soul School and Foundation. And we were doing a lot of those transformation talks, and many of those men have been listening for their own guidance since we started doing some of those transformation talks podcasts, Lacy, in the last few years anyway. They're listening for their service. Many of them are poised and still listening for their service, some taking more action steps because that's what's lining up for them, some still listening. But in that heartbeat inside them, they were touched by that experience. And they're all doing that. Maybe it's just in their presence. They've transcended something too. I'm sure their family members kind of look at them with the one eye of like, what was it? What was it that changed you? How are you, this calm presence? Or this person that used to respond in anger and may be able to take a deep breath, even back in the ordinary worlds of their lives with all the family members who didn't go to prison with them, and can be a voice of wisdom at a critical moment. And I think we are, a lot of us, these warriors, these heroes that return to share these deeper messages, but sometimes the messages are just our presence, where we're calm in the storm that's happening around us. So it is a powerful, powerful message. I mean, the resurrection is something we could probably have many podcasts on, or I could have other guests who talk about the spiritual aspects of the resurrection process for people who would be interested. A lot of the people that I interview and talk with in some of my other podcasts, we explore things like this. We go deeper into things like this. And people, though, in your realm, Lacy, and where people in the places where you teach, there's something for everyone in this journey. We can all relate to it because it is who we are, right? It's kind of the fabric of humanity inside us that comes alive in these stories and these stages. And I'm grateful to Joseph Campbell for putting this all together. It was all there through time, but he put it in a nice package of these stages. And I think 12 stages are highlighted, but some people, like, there are more. There are like sub-stages of all these things. Maybe that'll be 2023. We'll have to talk about that. We'll see. But I thank you. Did you have anything more to share?
No, I think, I think just to sort of simplify it as we round out, that I think that this is really the stage that the hero is. Obviously, it's the return. This is the stage in which they're returning, but they're really returning at many levels a very, very different being. Not just a changed person, but a resurrected human because of all they've been through up to that point. And they are headed back to the ordinary world, just very, very different and very changed from the inside out.
And it's evident to other people.
It's very
around
evident.
them.
It's very evident. So I thank you. I think this was beautiful, and I loved how you languaged a lot of this particular stage.
Well, thank you. I was just going to close on 2 short quotes that we've shared in some social media posts. One of them is from Deepak Chopra, and he says, "The symbolic language of the crucifixion is the death of the old paradigm. Resurrection is a leap into a whole new way of thinking." And we can change into a whole new way of being, into a whole new way of living, into a whole new way of sharing or being in service, right?
Right.
And then another quote from Voltaire, who said, "It is not more surprising to be born twice than once, everything in nature is resurrection. There's a lot of symbology in that one sentence. He's talking about basically being reborn or rebirthing, right? Experiencing some kind of personal rebirth or this new version of yourself. It's like the caterpillar into the butterfly. It's the metamorphosis. We have so many of these examples and expressions and illustrations around us. We just have to open our eyes to see them. Authors who wrote things 500 years ago or whatever it may be, it still resonates, right? Rumi is one of those people that leaves all these spiritual insights in his poems. So I want to thank everybody for joining us and for making this journey with us. We will be back to talk about the last stage, at least in the 12 phases of Joseph Campbell's work of the hero's journey. And we are at this point in time where their spring is birthing. Easter is on its way. We can maybe be more mindful, more self-aware. Maybe we allow ourselves to pay a little more attention to spring. Like, wow, every year those flowers do come back if they're perennials, right? And we watch the cycles of these things. The leaves are budding on all the trees here in North Carolina. And I hope in many places where you are, if you're in a part of the world that's experiencing spring, and even if you're not in a part of the world that's experiencing spring, you can still tap into spring's energy in this kind of blooming process and this rebirthing process, and really kind of look deeper at the cycles of the seasons that are a message for us all the time. So we invite you to visit us at wholesoulschoolandfoundation.org. As we said before, you can donate there to our vision and mission of expanding these broadcasts and having more of a staff at some point and growing these messages and touching more lives. And you can also shop our store, which you can do that through our website. So you could just go again to wholesoulschoolandfoundation.org and you can click into the shop and we will have more designs, right? So right now we have a few there, and each purchase helps to support the work that we do. And so we're grateful. We're grateful for everyone's support. And you can visit us on social media, right? All your favorite social media platforms, and you can watch the videos, but you can also listen to us through audio podcasts if you're on the go. I love putting us on Spotify or some of your other favorite listening platforms. So find us wherever you are, on the go or at home and at rest. We are here to be a message of the rising hero's journey, and we will see you next month with another Fireside Chats podcast soon. Blessings, everyone.